The woman pointed at a photograph of my family's dam and said, "Tear that rotten thing out. He owes us $500 and thinks the rules don't apply to him." 76 hands went up. Her husband recorded the vote on his phone. And 3 days later, their attorney asked a state court to order me to destroy the only structure keeping their homes out of the river. What none of them knew was that I had spent 31 years telling the state of Maine exactly which dams were safe, which ones were dangerous, and which valleys would disappear underwater if somebody made the wrong decision. My name is Elias Mercer. I was 57 when this happened, and my family has lived beside the Coldwater River outside the town of Bellwether since 1804, back when the road was mud. The winters were mean, and a man could build a mill with a hammer, a team of oxen, and the kind of patience nobody seems to have anymore. My fifth great-grandfather, Samuel Mercer, laid the first stones of the dam himself, building a narrow mill pond that powered a sawmill, a grain wheel, and eventually half the little businesses that kept Bellwether alive through the 19th century. My grandfather reinforced the western spillway after the flood of 927. My father rebuilt the timber gates in 1978, and I spent most of my adult life making sure the old structure remained sound, licensed, inspected, and quietly useful. Quietly useful is a dangerous thing these days, because people rarely respect what they do not notice. They only notice it when it stops working. About 900 feet downstream sat Alder Creek Preserve, a subdivision of 76 expensive homes built inside a wide, shallow bend in the valley, the sort of place with cedar siding, decorative stone mailboxes, and residents who said they wanted rural living as long as rural living came with fiber internet and somebody else removing the snow. The development had gone up 12 years earlier on former hayfields, and every engineer who reviewed the project understood that the Mercer Dam reduced spring peak flow before the river reached that bend. It was written into the county drainage report, the state flood map, and the developer's original insurance filing, though I would later discover that almost nobody on the HOA board had ever read any of those documents. Their president was Vanessa Pike, a 49-year-old former lifestyle consultant from Westchester who had moved north with her husband, Grant, to live closer to the land. Vanessa said that phrase often, usually while standing on somebody else's land. She ran a newsletter called A Better Village, where she wrote long essays about community values, traditional living, and the moral failure people who did not volunteer for committees she controlled. Grant handled the camera, the editing, and apparently the part where every disagreement became content. My first conversation with Vanessa happened at the Bellwether Harvest Fair 2 years before the lawsuit. She approached me beside the cider stand wearing spotless work boots and asked whether I would consider opening the mill pond for community kayaking. I told her it was not a recreational lake. It was a regulated reservoir attached to an operating flood control structure. She smiled in the patient way people smile when they believe your answer is merely the beginning of their negotiation. "Elias," she said, "water belongs to everyone. Rain does," I told her. "The dam, the gates, the liability, and the maintenance bills belong to me." Her smile tightened. "That is a very old-fashioned way to think." "So is gravity," I said. "But it still shows up every morning." She did not laugh. That was the moment, I think, when I became a problem she intended to solve. The invoice arrived the following October, printed on thick cream paper with the Alder Creek logo at the top and Vanessa's signature at the bottom. $500, annual watershed stewardship contribution, due within 30 days. The letter claimed that all adjacent landowners benefiting from shared water resources were required to contribute to the HOA's environmental fund. I was not adjacent to their water. They were downstream from mine. I was not a member of their HOA, had never signed their covenanters, and did not owe their environmental fund a nickel. I wrote, "Not a member, not enforceable," across the front and mailed it back. 2 weeks later, Vanessa drove up my gravel road in a white SUV that looked like it had never met mud voluntarily. I was repairing a hinge on the old mill door when she stepped out holding the returned envelope between 2 fingers. "You embarrassed me," she said. "I mailed you a legal notice. You mailed me a wish with a logo on it. The community voted. The community can vote to own the moon. Vanessa, it still won't change the deed." She walked closer, her expression calm but her neck turning red. "People are tired of your attitude." "Which people?" "The families who live downstream from your private obstruction." I set down my wrench. That private obstruction is one reason those families can live downstream. She looked past me toward the mill pond, smooth and gray beneath the October sky. That is exactly the kind of fear-based language that keeps communities from progressing. Then she handed me the envelope and said, very softly, "Pay the $500, Elias, or I will make this much more expensive for you." I had spent 3 decades in state government, which meant I had heard threats dressed as policy, threats dressed as concern, and threats delivered over bad coffee in conference rooms with no windows. Vanessa's was almost charming by comparison. Almost. I photographed the letter, logged the date and time of her visit, then placed the original in a fireproof cabinet beside the dam inspection records. My wife, Caroline, would have teased me for that. She used to say I documented life like I expected it to sue me. Caroline had been gone 4 years by then. Breast cancer. 17 months from diagnosis to the morning I sat beside her hospital bed and watched the strongest person I knew simply stop breathing. After she died, the mill became less of a property and more of a conversation I kept having with her. We had raised our daughter Nora there. We had eaten summer dinners on the dock, listened to frogs in the reeds, and watched fog lift off the water before sunrise. Caroline understood the dam was never just stone. It was duty, memory, and a promise passed from one set of hands to another. Vanessa saw an obstacle between herself and a prettier newsletter photograph. In November, the HOA sued me in small claims court for the $500, plus penalties, collection costs, administrative fees, and 18% interest, bringing their demand to just over $2,000. My attorney, Leonard Shaw, was 73, wore the same brown suit to every hearing, and had represented my father during a property line dispute involving a maple tree and 2 brothers who eventually stopped speaking over 11 inches of soil. Leonard read the complaint, took off his glasses, and said, "This is either the dumbest case I have seen this year, or the opening move in something larger." "It is November," I said. "Plenty of time left for something dumber." The judge dismissed the case in less than 5 minutes, explaining that an HOA cannot invent financial obligations for people outside its membership. Vanessa sat behind her attorney with her arms folded, staring at me as though I had cheated by understanding the law. I should have felt relieved, but I did not, because people like Vanessa rarely mistake a loss for a warning. They mistake it for permission to escalate. 6 weeks later, Leonard called me at 7 in the morning and told me to sit down. Alder Creek Preserve had retained a Portland environmental firm and filed a petition in state land court accusing my family's dam of illegally impounding public water, damaging aquatic habitat, creating an unreasonable flood hazard, and operating without valid authorization. They wanted the court to order complete removal. I read the petition twice at my kitchen table while snow tapped against the windows. Every claim was false. The dam was fully licensed through 2031. Its sediment tests were clean. Its fish passage plan had been approved, and its flood mitigation value had been confirmed in a state study I had helped write. Then I reached the final page and saw the name of their consulting engineer, Preston Vale. I knew Preston. He had taken my hydraulic structures seminar 15 years earlier and nearly failed after submitting a reservoir model that forgot to include rainfall. Leonard listened while I explained that over the phone. Then there was a long silence. "Elias," he finally said, "do these people know you were chief engineer for the state dam safety office?" I looked through the kitchen window at the river, the old stone spillway, and the 76 roofs barely visible through the trees downstream. "No," I said, "and I am starting to think nobody has told them what happens to that subdivision if they win." The first thing I did was call Nora. She was 26, finishing a graduate degree in watershed science at the University of Maine, and she had inherited her mother's habit of going completely silent when something made her angry. She came home that Saturday with 2 laptops, a box of old survey maps, and enough coffee to keep a small fire department awake through a winter storm. I spread the court petition across the kitchen table, then placed the state flood report beside it, along with the original development drainage plan for Alder Creek Preserve. Nora read everything without speaking, her fingers moving slowly across the contour lines. Finally, she turned the map toward me and tapped the shallow bowl where the subdivision sat. "Dad, if the dam is removed before spring runoff, this whole section fills. How much of it? The lowest 19 houses first, then the middle 28, and if we get rain on top of melting snow, probably all 76. She leaned back and stared at me. "Their own flood report says that. Their original developer knew it. Does Vanessa know? I doubt Vanessa knows where the report is. Nora looked down at the lawsuit again. Then somebody else knows, and they are hoping nobody checks. That sentence stayed with me. Leonard had already suggested we examine the HOA's finances, but Nora's suspicion pushed me further. Over the next week, I searched county records, state business filings, planning commission minutes, and property transfers around the old mill pond. That was how I found North Bend Renewal Partners, a limited liability company formed 7 months earlier by Graham Pike and a Portland real estate broker named Celeste Ward. The company had submitted 3 quiet inquiries to the county about developing 6 acres of newly recoverable land if the Mercer Reservoir were restored to its natural channel. Restored was a polite word for drained. The 6 acres they wanted sat directly behind my dam, beneath the water that had covered them for more than 2 centuries. Grant and Celeste had even commissioned a preliminary sketch showing 12 luxury cottages, a walking path, and something called an authentic riverfront commons. I laughed when I read that phrase, not because it was funny, but because sometimes anger comes out wearing the wrong coat. Vanessa had called me selfish for refusing to contribute $500 to the community, while her husband was quietly trying to create millions of dollars in private real estate from the bottom of my mill pond. Leonard studied the documents at my kitchen table, chewing slowly on the end of a yellow pencil. There it is, he said. Not environmental concern, not public access, not flood safety. Dirt, mud. Technically, expensive mud. We built our response carefully. I pulled every inspection record dating back to 1947, every permit renewal, every sediment analysis, every repair invoice, and every photograph from the last 30 years. Nora rebuilt the downstream flood model using current precipitation data and 3 runoff scenarios: a 10-year flood, a 50-year flood, and a 100-year flood. Under the mildest scenario, removing the dam increased peak discharge through Alder Creek by 48%. Under the worst, the first 4 water depth in the lowest homes reached nearly 7 feet. We included the business filings for North Bend Renewal Partners and labeled the exhibit Undisclosed Financial Interest of Parties Supporting Removal. Our filing ran 268 pages. The HOA's response ran 8. Their attorneys called my work self-serving, outdated, and emotionally attached to private property. Preston Vale submitted a 2-page affidavit claiming the dam's flood control value was likely overstated because modern rivers should be allowed to behave naturally. He did not include a model, a site inspection, a rainfall analysis, or even a measured cross-section of the river. Nora read his statement, circled 1 paragraph, and said, he used the word likely 4 times in 6 sentences. That is what engineers write when the numbers refuse to cooperate. The hearing was scheduled for March 19 before Judge Evelyn Rourke, a 62-year-old land court judge with a reputation for favoring restoration projects. The snowpack in the western mountains was already running 20% above average. I knew her reputation, Leonard knew it, and apparently Vanessa did too, because she arrived at court smiling like a woman who had reserved the table for victory. She wore a blue suit, pearl earrings, and the same spotless boots she had worn to the harvest fair. Rand sat behind her with his phone turned sideways until a court officer told him recording was prohibited. Their attorney opened by describing the dam as an obsolete private barrier that denied the public access to a natural river. He called the mill pond stagnant, the stones deteriorated, and my safety reports compromised by personal attachment. Then Preston took the stand. He spoke smoothly for almost 40 minutes, using phrases like ecological reconnection and watershed justice, which sounded impressive until Leonard began asking questions. Had he physically inspected the dam? No. Had he reviewed the 1947 Federal Reinforcement Report? Not in full. Had he modeled downstream peak discharge after removal? He believed existing literature made that unnecessary. Had he reviewed Alder Creek's original drainage analysis? He could not recall. Had he known I served as chief engineer of the State Dam Safety Office for 11 years? There was a pause. Vanessa turned toward her attorney. Preston swallowed. I was aware Mr. Mercer had government experience. Leonard looked at the judge. Government experience. Mr. Mercer personally inspected 906 dams during his career, including every high-hazard structure in this region. The courtroom shifted. You could feel it. The way people sit differently when the man being described as a stubborn landowner turns out to be the person the state used to call when a spillway cracked at 2 in the morning. When I testified, I kept my voice even. I walked the judge through the dam's history, its licensing, the reservoir volume, the floodplain, and Nora's 3 models. The HOA attorney tried to make me look sentimental. Mr. Mercer, this structure has been in your family for generations, correct? Yes, so you would do almost anything to preserve it. No, I would do anything reasonable to preserve the people downstream from it. He frowned. That was not my question. It is my answer. Near the end, Judge Rourke asked me directly what would happen if the dam were removed during spring runoff. I looked at Vanessa, then at the rows of Alder Creek residents who had come to watch. The valley will flood, I said. Not possibly, not symbolically, and not in some distant climate scenario. The lower homes will take water within hours of a major runoff event, and the rest will follow if rain arrives on saturated snow. This dam does not threaten Alder Creek Preserve. It protects it. For the first time that day, Vanessa stopped smiling. 11 days later, the judge issued a compromise order. I could keep the dam only if I paid $1,500 toward the HOA's legal expenses and completed a new independent environmental review within 60 days. I paid under protest and hired 2 outside specialists, a fisheries biologist named Dr. Lena Ortiz and a hydraulic engineer named Malcolm Reeve. They inspected the site, reviewed Nora's model, and concluded the dam was structurally sound, ecologically manageable, and essential to downstream flood control. Their report was 312 pages. The HOA objected because I had selected and paid the experts. Judge Rourke agreed that the process lacked neutrality. On May 2nd, she ordered complete removal within 90 days. I read the order alone in the mill office, listening to water move to the gate my father had rebuilt with his own hands. For a few minutes I imagined refusing. I imagined chaining myself to the spillway, calling reporters, making the whole thing ugly enough that somebody in Augusta would intervene. Then I thought about Caroline, who had always said anger was useful only when you gave it a job, so I gave mine one. Leonard filed every appeal available, and I sent formal flood warnings by certified mail to the state emergency agency, the county sheriff, the Bellwether Select Board, the governor's office, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and every member of the Alder Creek HOA board. Each packet contained the flood models, the expert reports, and a plain language summary that began with one sentence: removal of the Mercer Dam will create a foreseeable and potentially catastrophic flood hazard to Alder Creek Preserve. I also wrote Vanessa a personal letter offering to suspend removal if the HOA withdrew its petition. She posted a photograph of the letter in her newsletter under the title, "Fear is not science." Grant added a laughing emoji. I hired a licensed dam removal contractor named Owen Kell, a former Army Corps engineer with 20 years of river work behind him. He read the court order, walked the site twice, then sat across from me in the kitchen. "Elias, this structure should not come down. I know. And certainly not before the spring runoff settles." "I know that too." He stared at me. "You are really going to comply?" I looked through the window at the roofs downstream. "I am going to make sure nobody can ever say they were not warned." Owen signed an affidavit stating his professional objection, install flow sensors above and below the site, and agreed to salvage every original stone. On the morning work began. Nora stood beside me on the dock wearing Caroline's old red scarf. The mill pond was flat as dark glass. "Mom would hate this," she said. "Your mother hated stupidity in all its forms. What would she tell you?" I watched Owen's excavator crawl toward the eastern spillway. "She would tell me the river keeps better records than people do." At 8:47 that morning, the bucket lifted the first stone out of the Mercer Dam, and down at Alder Creek Preserve, Vanessa Pike was already planning a celebration. Vanessa held her celebration 3 nights after the last stone came out. She called it the River Freedom Gathering, for knit little blue banners with silver fish on them, and served wine beneath a rented tent beside the Alder Creek Clubhouse. Grant filmed her standing in front of a poster that said "We gave the river back," while Preston Vale explained to 42 residents that nature had finally been allowed to heal. I was not there. Nora and I were moving tractors, business records, tools, family photographs, and my father's old dam survey books to the stone house on the ridge, 58 feet above the valley floor. Owen had left the flow sensors running in the empty reservoir bed, and every hour the numbers climbed a little higher. The mountain snow was melting fast, but the weather forecast was what worried me most. A warm storm moving north with 3 inches of rain expected over ground already soaked from thaw. At midnight, rain began tapping against the roof. By 2 in the morning, it sounded like gravel. At 5, Nora came into the kitchen carrying her laptop, her face pale in the blue light from the screen. "Dad, cold water is already above the 50-year model." I poured coffee and looked at the discharge graph. "How fast is it rising?" "Faster than our worst projection." By 8, the river had doubled. By noon, it had tripled. At 3:17 that afternoon, the upstream sensor registered a surge so sharp the graph looked like somebody had driven a nail through it. Nora stared at the screen and whispered, "There it is." The flood wave reached the old dam site 26 minutes later. With no reservoir to slow it, the water tore through the empty channel, carrying branches, stones, chunks of riverbank, and 200 years of stored silt downstream in one brown moving wall. At 4:12, the northern drainage ditch at Alder Creek overflowed. At 4:29, the first basement filled. At 4:41, my landline rang. I knew who it was before I answered. "Elias." Vanessa's voice sounded smaller than I remembered. "The water is coming through our windows. Where are you?" "In the basement. Grant is trying to move the cars. Get upstairs now. But the generator and the electrical panel are down here. Leave them. Do not touch anything electrical. Tell Grant to get out of the garage and go to the second floor." She started crying, and for one brief, ugly second, part of me wanted to remind her about the $500. I wanted to ask whether the river felt liberated enough for her now. Then I heard Caroline's voice in my head. Not angry, just disappointed. And that was worse. "Vanessa, listen carefully. Take drinking water, blankets, medication, and your phone's upstairs. Do not drive. Do not walk through the water. Rescue crews will come when the current settles enough to reach you. Elias, please help us. I already called the county emergency office. They have your neighborhood marked as the first priority." There was a silence. Then she said, "You knew this would happen." "Yes, and you let it happen." I closed my eyes. "No, Vanessa. I warned you it would happen. And then I obeyed the order you fought to obtain." I hung up because other calls were already coming in. By nightfall, 51 homes had water on the first floor. 4 had shifted on their foundations. And every road into Alder Creek was submerged. The volunteer fire department launched 2 aluminum boats from the old dairy field. The county sheriff brought a swift water team. A National Guard unit arrived before midnight with high-clearance trucks. And Owen showed up with his excavator. 2 pumps, and the expression of a man who had hoped his sworn affidavit would never become evidence. Nora worked beside the emergency coordinator, using our model to predict which streets would flood next. I spent the night checking current speed, marking safe approach routes, and helping crews pull families from upstairs windows. Nobody died. I want that understood. Because for all the damage, all the lawsuits, all the pride and stupidity involved, nobody died. Vanessa was rescued from an upstairs bedroom at 7:14 the next morning. Grant was found in the garage attic clutching a waterproof case containing camera equipment and documents from North Bend Renewal Partners. A guard sergeant handed the case to a state investigator, who apparently found the contents interesting enough to make 3 phone calls before breakfast. 4 days later, the Maine Attorney General announced an investigation into undisclosed financial interests connected to the dam removal litigation. The planning inquiries, development sketches, private emails, and payment records inside Grant's case showed that he and Celeste Ward expected to earn more than $3 million if the drained reservoir land became available. Vanessa claimed she had known nothing about it. Grant claimed she had known everything. Their marriage did not survive the disagreement. The floodwater receded slowly, leaving mud, broken furniture, ruined furnaces, and a smell that stayed in the valley for weeks. Nora and I worked with rescue crews for 12 days. Vanessa avoided me until the 9th morning, when she found me outside the community center checking a cracked foundation. She wore donated sweatpants and a Red Cross jacket. Her hair was tied back, and for once, there was no camera near her. "You could say it," she said. "Say what? That you told me so?" I looked toward the rows of cots inside the gym. "Would it dry anybody's house?" She shook her head. "Then, I do not see the use." She started to walk away, then stopped. "Why are you helping us?" I thought about Caroline, my father, and every Mercer who had worked beside that river without expecting applause, because the dam was never only protecting my family. 2 weeks later, the governor called and asked whether the structure could be rebuilt. I said yes, but only if it became a regional flood control project with public oversight, permanent inspection funding, and no private development rights in the reservoir bed. At the community meeting, 72 of the 76 homeowners voted in favor. Vanessa resigned before the vote. Judge Rourke attended and publicly admitted she had given too little weight to the engineering record. The new project received federal disaster funding, state support, and a contribution from Alder Creek's insurance settlement. Owen led construction. Nora designed the new hydrology model as part of her graduate thesis. We reused every stone we had salvaged, wrapping the old face around the modern reinforced core built for storms my ancestors could never have imagined. 18 months later, the Mercer Community Flood Dam stood 12 feet higher than the original. A bronze plaque beside the spillway read, "BUILT First by One Family, More BUILT by Athlete the Lyrand, Why It Matter." At the dedication, Vanessa did not attend, but she mailed me a short letter with no excuses in it. She wrote that she had mistaken confidence for knowledge and leadership for control. I keep that letter in the same cabinet as her first invoice. Sometimes the distance between arrogance and humility is $500, one court order, in 7 feet of muddy water. I still walk the dam every Friday. At dusk, I sit on the rebuilt dock with Caroline's old thermos and watch the mist rise from the pond. Nora says I talk to her out there. Maybe I do. I tell her the river is behaving, the gates are sound, and people downstream finally understand what the stones were doing all those years. But I still wonder about one thing, and I want to know what you think. Was I right to obey the court order after every warning failed? Or should I have broken the law and refused to remove the dam, even if it meant prison? Tell me in the comments who carried the real blame. Vanessa, the judge, the engineer, the HOA residents who voted without asking questions, or me for knowing what would happen and letting the river prove it. Share this story with someone who thinks quiet people are easy to push around. And subscribe, because next week a coastal HOA tries to take a retired marine biologist's oyster beds, then discovers the bay has rules of its own.